All right, here we are back again discussing Emily Bronte this time and the poem of hers we read from class called Stanzas. All right, Emily Bronte is another 19th century author. She also was born in England, like many of the authors we're reading this week. In fact, I think it's all of them. Yes. Um, yes, well, America is still the colonies, or not the colonies, it wasn't the colonies. Hello, we had the American Revolution by then. But we were a burgeoning country, with not a lot of education going on for women at the time, not a lot of wealth, a lot of tutors going around too. I mean, for men, yes. But, so we don't see a lot of female writers, although we have studied some. We've studied Phyllis Wheatley and Anne Bradstreet, who wrote over in America, and we will be studying some more from this time period, but not this week. This week we're studying a lot of British writers, and Emily Bronte is another one of those. If you look at the written out lecture, we have portraits of Emily Bronte. So there are three of them. There's one on the left that is assumed to be Emily Bronte. It's a tracing from the gun group portrait. That's what it's called. And so we think that is her because we looked at the other ones and it's the sisters. And so that one is presumed to be Emily. In the center is an undisputed portrait of Emily Bronte in the pillar portrait painted by her teenage brother, Branwell, who wanted to be an artist. When he was only 15 years old, he painted this. So that's really neat. And we know that's her. And then on the right of those three pictures in the lecture is a photograph of Emily. The photograph was taken around 1848. So she would be about 30 years old there. So that's kind of neat. Yeah. But anyway, I think that may be the first photograph we have of any of our writers. So that's really neat that we have that. All right, well, explore the following website with links to biographical and literary information that is in the lecture. If you want to know more about Emily, fascinating life, fascinating family also. There's a website link to also biographical and literary information. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's from Victorian Web. So, and then there is a YouTube Newsweek clip about Emily Bronte and her life. So you can watch that too if you want to learn a little bit more about her and her incredible family. Yeah, very interesting sibling. Actually, they remind me of like Little Women. If you've ever read that book and the life that those sisters had together, it reminds me of the life that Emily seems as if she had with her sisters and her brother. So she lived from 1816 till 1855, till only 30 years of age. Yeah, when she tragically died of tuberculosis, incited by a cold she caught on the day of the funeral of her brother Branwell, who also died young and tragically, though from complications of alcoholism. So yeah, more tragedy. So many of these writers deal with such tragedy in their lives and often die young. So many, especially of the women writers that we've read so far. But it's not going to end there. Like, a lot of them deal with a lot of issues. Hard to know if there are other things that propel them to write or if it's just like that's what follows. Um, you know, from these kinds of lives, or it just was the times they lived in, or maybe you have to have gone through some sort of experience to impel you to write. I don't know. It's interesting to speculate on, but a lot of them we do read, and they die young and have a lot of tragedy in their lives. Although maybe everybody has a lot of tragedy in their lives, really, when you think about it. Not everybody dies young, but anyway, she died at 30. In fact, all the Bronte children, and even their mother, suffered tragically young deaths. Emily was the fifth of 6 children. Her mother died soon after she birthed Emily's younger sister, Anne. Emily's older sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, both died of typhoid and tuberculosis, which they had respectively contracted at the school that the Bronte children attended, one of those women academies, and died at 29 of tuberculosis. That's her younger sister. And then Emily, of course, died at 30 of tuberculosis. Charlotte died at 39 while she was pregnant, possibly of malnutrition and dehydration, or typhoid or tuberculosis. These were diseases that were rampant at the time. Tuberculosis was often known as consumption at the time, and it was marked by a cough, that you would have this cough. They would cough, 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 and when it got really bad, they would cough up blood, and they would eventually die from that. I mean, we haven't wiped out tuberculosis in this world. We still have it, but it's far, far less common for people to die of that. We have antibiotics to treat that. So a lot of, it's a lot of poets and artists and things like that died tragically of tuberculosis. Like you see that in operas of the time, like La Boheme. People, the main character died. Oh, no spoilers, but there's tuberculosis and people die from it. How's that? I think also La Traviata. And anyway, it plagued people the way, other diseases have plagued people in our time period. Like we have, AIDS was such a plague for so long, with people dying from that, until we were able to come up with treatments that could prolong people's life living with AIDS. Anyway, so tuberculosis, yeah, a lot of her family died from it. Emily never married and spent much of her life at home on the moors of Haworth. So moors are like these big grassy areas that are in the more northern part of it, like above London, big grassy areas covered with wildflowers and just, beautiful expanses of land. Where her father was a clergyman and curate, Emily attended a few different schools, including one in Belgium. So that's kind of neat. But she always preferred to be home, where she could read books in her father's library. And so again, it's that library. So those families that had well-stocked libraries, girls could go to those and educate themselves at home. And we see those, so many of our writers had been self-educated, at least to a degree, where they would read so much of, a well-stocked library that their families had. They were privileged to have that. Anyway, she loved to be at home reading from her father's library, and she also loved being home because she could live in the fantastical lands with grand adventures that she and her remaining siblings, Branwell, Charlotte, and Anne, all invented. So Branwell was the boy, and he was the one who wanted to be the painter. So he worked as an artist from a young age, trying to develop his skills, and the whole family would sacrifice a lot to try to get Branwell's artistic career off the ground. They were the ones that they thought, he was going to be the great artist. Little did they know, Charlotte, Anne, and Emily, all three of them would become famous authors. Now, these, like I said, it reminded me of the life that the Little Women had, where they were always they were inventing adventures and putting on plays and things like that. Well, these four children, Branwell, Charlotte, Anne, and Emily, would invent these grand adventures together, and they invented a kingdom that they called Gondal. They would make up their adventures in the Gondal kingdom. Much of Emily's poetry involves their made-up adventures in their Gondal kingdom, where Emily was the queen. So kind of neat. Emily often wrote of her adventures, while she would also record her daily domestic life at Haworth. So she would write about her domestic world and her real life, and mesh that into her romanticized adventures in her fantasy world of Gondal. Emily's blending of the domestic with the fantastical echoes the natural supernaturalism of other romantic writers of the era, like Shelley and Coleridge. They like to blend those things together. And there was that interest in the spiritual or the occult. Remember, I told you about that, and the invention of science fiction. So there was this supernaturalism that was popular, or at least growing in popularity at the time, an emphasis on fantasy and things not of this world, or things that were of the imagination, but it was also blended with real life and nature. And you see that in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poetry. You see nature, of course, in William Wordsworth's poetry, but then the fusing of the two in Shelley and Coleridge. And Shelley, of course, Percy Bysshe Shelley, that was the poet husband of Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley. And Mary Shelley herself wrote of, fantastical worlds and inventions in Frankenstein and the Mortal Immortal and other writings of hers. So these impulses emerged not only in Emily's one and only novel. She only wrote one novel, but boy, was it a doozy. It was Wuthering Heights, also a very famous novel in its own right, and made her name as a writer in 1847. But also in her poetry, much of which at least alluded to her adventures in Gondal, that made-up kingdom that the siblings inhabited in their play adventures together. Her sister Charlotte discovered the manuscripts of Emily's poems and decided they were so compelling that she would try to have them published along with her own poems and her sister Anne's poems. So they all three wrote poetry, and they published them in a single collection of poems called Poems of Currer, Acton, and Ellis Bell in 1846. So, yeah, Currer, Acton, and Ellis Bell. Those were the male pseudonyms that the sisters used because they feared the public's misogynist reactions towards female writers. In other words, misogynist meaning not liking women. So the three sisters published their poems under actually androgynous pseudonyms. I mean, they sound like male names, but Currer, Acton, and Ellis, right? Like, who really knows, right? Could that go both ways? Could that be male? Could that be female? Anyway, they used those pseudonyms, and each pseudonym actually matched the first letter of the women's actual name. So Currer, starting with C, was Charlotte's male pseudonym, and Acton, that starts with an A, so that was Anne's pseudonym. And Ellis Bell, starting with an E, was Emily's pseudonym. So they correlated that way to their actual names. Now, the volume of poetry was not very successful, but became of interest when the three sisters published their novels the next year. Anne published Agnes Grey, Emily published Wuthering Heights, and Charlotte published Jane Eyre. They're all like really famous novels. Amazing. It was all from one family of three sisters. So Jane Eyre was an immediate hit with the public. And that's kind of like almost like a gothic novel in the sense that it's got, it's dark, and it's got themes of like the monster woman, the monstrous woman, woman is monster. And it, not that she's a monster, but the way she's confined and the way she's, described and the condition she has cast her as kind of like that monstrous female archetype. Anyway, after Emily died, Charlotte found and published more of Emily's poems. Now, the poem we read for class, called Stanzas, was published in 1850. So that was published while she was still alive, 5 years before she ended up dying. And like so many of Emily's other writings, it combines the pedestrian or the everyday, the very banal, common life with the fantastical, the natural with the supernatural, as characteristic of so many other romantic writers of this era. So enjoy that poem and see what of Gondal you can spy in it, and what of fantasy and domesticity you can spy in it, and what of her natural landscape you can. Alrighty, enjoy Emily Bronte and Stanzas, a very fascinating writer and family of writers from this era. We could have studied all three of them, really, but we only have time for so many, right? So we're reading Emily Bronte. Remember, she wrote Wuthering Heights, very famous novel, made into movies several times over. So enjoy, please enjoy. Alrighty.